Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Recent data shows that the typical American student is stunningly ignorant of their own history. Even devoid of the data, I've noticed this myself. With only 20% of students, the typical American student, scoring proficient in the question of civics, Randall Smith joins us to take a look at the problem, and he offers us a solution. Randall is no stranger to this program, professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. His latest book is From Here to Eternity, Reflections on Death, Immortality, and the Resurrection of the Body. Randall, thank you for joining us. How are you?
No, wonderful to be back. Always nice to talk to you.
Always nice to reconnect with you as well. Let's jump right into the thick of it. Why have we become so ignorant when it comes to... So we can talk about United States history, but also just generally Western history.
Well, again, two things, I suppose. One is simply that, as schools focus on STEM, then to a certain extent they just don't consider those other disciplines as important. So they tend to get less focus, right? The other issue is when you teach history through textbooks, it can be very boring. There are history professors who make it wonderfully, exciting, and people get into the adventure of Western civilization or of American history. But, again, textbooks can be a problem. And, of course, once textbooks go the direction of being ideologically based, well, then people are much less, eager to use them, whether they're ideologically, conservative, which is very, very rare, or much is more rare, more common, ideologically progressive. You're right. So America's a terrible thing, et cetera, et cetera. Again, then people are like, well, why would I spend time studying something which is all just really bad, right? And so these things tend to drop out, as there's a famous, phrase, which is to say that there's a commonality. The first name of most civics teachers, and I think it would be true of a number of history teachers, but the first name of most civics teachers is coach. So
can you explain that a little more?
That's the position that people get, right, when it's like, well, we don't really care about you as a teacher. We want you to coach basketball or football, and we'll shove you in, you go take that civics textbook and teach them some stuff, and then, spend your day working on the football or the basketball or the, volleyball team.
Could some of this damage be attributed to a shift in the way civics is taught? For example, most schools no longer have history departments, but they have social studies departments, and so there's been a ideological paradigm shift.
Yeah, I think you're right. Again, the notion that, and this is true of many of the humanities, rather than embracing something rigorous, you tend to then sort of like, well, can we glom it in with a bunch of other stuff? And so again, instead of, English literature and studying Shakespeare, it's like, well, let's stick it in with a bunch of other stuff. Right. And so we don't really need a history class. We just need to study cultures or something. Right. And then, of course, again, once the thing has lost all its rigor, then it's interesting because people do this because they think, well, we'll be able to attract more students. But when things lose their rigor, it tends to actually alienate the students who are bright. Again, once you start to say, oh, students aren't smart enough to read, the Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne or something, then people are like, oh, and then they read stupid stories, right, which are much less interesting. They don't read Shakespeare anymore. They read some other little novel, and then students are like bored by that. And teachers are bored by that, right? And so then they leave,
Now, I want to refocus on what you were talking about in terms of progressive ideological leans. The unfortunate ubiquitousness of critical theory, in the way we're studying history in the West, that has lent not just to a negative outlook on history, has it also lent to a revisionist concept of history, so much so that the lack of proficiency is because they know the wrong facts.
Right. So again, once you lose the rigor, right, you can get things like that New York Times history program that came out a few years ago, the name of which is escaping me right at the moment. But, it's kind of like, the whole history, the 1619 Project, right? The whole history of the United States is a whole racist project, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there were any number of major historians that came out and said, it's not completely false, but there's just a lot of really sloppy scholarship here and some things which are just not true. But, of course, that didn't keep the people from pushing the narrative because it served their ideological goal.
What is that goal? What is the end of teaching history in that way?
Well, I think, and I'm actually sort of writing about this, right, that the goal is to, in the same way, it's not exactly the same as Marxism. But again, why is it always the case that Marxists want to, or communist governments want to control history? Because they want to show that they are somehow the culmination of history, that history has somehow been a kind of development, with dialectical development, one side, the other side, one side. But the point is the culmination of all that is us. So in the same way that when people say, well, you don't want to be on the wrong side of history, do you? Right? Which just means, don't you see, I'm not making an argument for euthanasia or something like that. I'm just simply saying, well, history, all those of us understand history and are become progressive, we understand that this is somehow the culmination of history. And it's like, well, but don't you have to argue for the legitimacy of that? Well, but not if it's somehow, for these people, the culmination of history. So if you show that somehow, or you make the argument that, well, don't you see that all of history moves towards, culminating in, us, American liberalism of a certain sort. And that if you don't have this, well, then you're kind of retrograde, right? You're stuck in the past. You don't really understand how things are now. There's always that kind of thing, right?
How does that paradigm, as misplaced as it is, contribute to the lack of charity we are giving to historical figures? For example, demonizing and villainizing historical figures in light of, modern conceptions and kind of retroactive viewing of history.
Well, it's important then, right, if you want to reread, reinterpret history, particularly the history of the United States, because you've got to take all these characters who are heroes and undermine them, right? You have to say, no, you shouldn't take them as a model because they're the thing, particularly if somehow they, in some previous time, we saw them as part of, the great adventure of America, Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt. It's just so, but the point is, you have to say, oh, no, see, those guys were all fallen, horrible characters. And so those heroes that you had in the past, they're not heroes at all. They're ultimately villains because the whole thing is villainous. And so because the whole thing is villainous, we have to throw all that out. And then what are we left with? Well, you have to embrace the progressive mindset, right? This is what we need to do now.
Especially as Catholics, who, whether we like it or not, part of our call is to have some sense of history, right? The right view of history. What kind of detriment does that cause to the Catholic worldview?
Well, I'm actually, right, it's interesting you asked this. I'm working on a book right now about how this kind of Hegelian historicism destroyed Catholic moral theology in the 20th century, because what you get is a circumstance where people say, well, human nature changes over time, so what was true and valid back, 200 years ago or during the time of Thomas Aquinas isn't true or valid anymore. And that's the challenge.
My guest is Dr. Randall Smith, Professor of Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. We're talking about history and Catholicism. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Beat. I'm talking with Dr. Randall Smith. He is a professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. We're talking about essentially history and Catholicism. So to get back to the heart of your article, Randall, one of the things you pointed out is the way in which we're engaging civics education is problematic. So it's not just a problem of curriculum, it's also a problem of pedagogy.
Yeah, I agree. Again, I would like to see rigorous American history looking at the original texts. When I taught the course that I was writing about in this article on the Catholics thing, I started out with, it was a course called The Foundations of Service. And I started out with, with Pope John Paul II's encyclical on the laity. But then we read the Constitution. We read selections of the Federalist Papers. I just think every single, student in the United States should be well versed in all that material, just as a basic citizen of the United States. But then later on, what I did was aware that there is a problem with people we want them to be involved in civics projects. Well, then they send them out to be on, marches, not a king rallies or something like that. I thought, no, this isn't what I want. And so I sent them out to be to attend a city council meeting, a county commissioners meeting, and a school board meeting. Now, if I'd been in the capital of the state, I would have tried to send them to a state legislature meeting, right? Because I wanted them to see civics, right, and Republican Democratic government at all its different levels. And I wanted them to see that so much of what they really care about is actually local politics, right? And that almost never gets covered in, the national news. And so they think, Ted Cruz, who's the senator of Texas, why doesn't he do X? And the point is because Ted Cruz is a senator in Washington, D.C. He's not hanging out here, in Houston where I live and trying to figure out what to do about bad roads. For that, you got to figure out whether there's city roads or county roads. And, of course, if the schools are bad, well, then you're going to have to go to the school board meeting. So I sent my students off to these meetings, and I said, okay, look, you're not supposed to say anything. You don't know anything. You don't know enough. And fortunately, they realized pretty quickly they didn't. But I said, what I want you to do is watch and listen, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss what you saw. And I want you to go respectfully, because even if it's kind of chaotic, I want you to realize the people there are at least invested in democratic education, and I mean not education, but democratic governance in a way that many people aren't. They just don't show up. And they did, and to their credit, they saw the good in the midst of, I thought they might be sort of put off by what was likely going to be kind of chaotic, but they all sort of said, no, it was pretty impressive and very interesting, and we had good discussions.
Were we always like this, that as a society, students, a studying society, we feel the need to have a preformed opinion before we've become students at the foot of masters who've thought about the issue, or simply at the facts?
Right. And that's the thing I wanted them to see. And they did see. I might in the future have them prepare a little bit more. It was interesting. It was the first time I'd actually gotten a chance to do this. But they very quickly realized two things. One, they didn't really know what was being discussed, or they didn't really know enough to have a good opinion about what was being discussed. I mean, there were things that that's a little worrisome, but I don't know, maybe that's okay. And the other thing they noticed pretty quickly, actually, because again, unfortunately, I wasn't having them make any comments. I told them not to, was they realized in all these cases, at least in our locality, you're not allowed to make I imagine this is true in many places, you're not allowed to make a speech any longer than 2 minutes. So they realized, wow, because we make them do speeches in our honors program. And the point is they realized, wow, 2 minutes. I'd have to get all my genius, right, whatever position I have, down into a 2-minute speech. That would be really hard. And they just realized, yeah, this is a challenge being part of this, right? And understanding enough, and then to be able to speak convincingly enough to convince other people to go along with, what they might consider to be a better idea.
There's a kind of character issue, or at least a virtue issue in that you're highlighting, that I'd like you to speak into, which is especially when it comes to having an opinion and then publicly sharing that opinion. A big part of that is earning the right to be heard. Now, that can be done in a myriad of different ways, but that's a crucial component in being able to share that opinion. I invite you to speak to that.
Yeah. No, and I mean, this is why I had them not speak in a way. And again, they, to their credit, they realized pretty quickly, like, yeah, I don't know what I would have said. Because they realized, look, it wasn't just a question of being self-righteous or whatever. They went in because we've been reading, the document on the laity, Christi Fidelis Laici by Tom, and so they thought, yes, I'm supposed to be a leaven in society. I'm supposed to be a servant of the common good. We've been reading this kind of stuff, and so they went in sort of at least with that mindset, and they knew that was kind of what we were being discussing, and they realized, I don't know how I would do that. I don't know enough here to actually have a good opinion. There was one case where they're building a homeless shelter, and it's down the street from a school on one side of town. And, of course, the mayor said, oh, no, don't worry about it at all. It's going to be a great homeless shelter. We're going to have all the best people and counselors and whatever. And I said, were you convinced by that? And they were like, well, not really, but we didn't know enough. We want to help the homeless, but should it be right down the street from this school? We didn't know where it was exactly. And, anyway, so they just realized both sides on the debate had legitimate concerns, but they didn't know which would be the best thing involved. Now, part of that, of course, was they didn't have skin in the game, right? It wasn't their school, wasn't their brothers and sisters going to that school. They might have had a very different view. If it was kind of like, my little sister goes to that school, and doggone it, anyway. But, they could see that this is tough. There are a lot of different values involved here, not just good people versus evil people, which is the way movies oftentimes make it.
Right, everything is not as morally black and white. If I may pivot the issue just a little bit to talk about a Catholic perspective of our history and the founding of the United States, for example, I think it's attributed to a bit of an ignorance in terms of civics and having a kind of contextual understanding of our civics. But I've noticed in dialogue that there are facets of Catholic thinkers and opinions wanting a kind of post-liberalistic integralist, like Catholic law ought to be the law of the land, especially here in the United States. I invite your thoughts on that and the pros and the cons and how we as Catholics ought to think about the issue.
Well, I think there's no better guide than Thomas Aquinas, quite frankly, myself. But there's always the warnings, I think, of Augustine's City on God, which is to say, and Aquinas understands this, it's always going to be a very imperfect thing. And this is one of the issues that I think progressivism, makes hay out of, which is to say, if you're looking for the perfect society, there's always going to be fallenness in the world. And so the thing that progressives can promise is that, don't you see that as we progress, right, if, for example, if marriages are somewhat unhappy, there's some difficulties. Well, if we just change all the laws and we change the culture and we open these things up, then we'll get great things. And the point is look, it's always going to be a fallen, imperfect world, and the church understands that. And I think the wisdom of people like Augustine and Aquinas is to understand that in politics, you can do some wonderful things, but you just have to be very careful about how far you think you can go. Right, to win with not only politics, right, but national, federal, politics, top-down sort of thing. It's a very important part of the church's social teaching, the principle of subsidiarity, right, the notion that somehow authority should be held by those who are closest to the problems that might have the wisdom to actually deal with those problems, including, of course, church groups. And this is just a thing we've lost because, again, most of our media focuses solely on national politics. And we've lost local papers and local news coverage largely, and people aren't interested. But that's where the rubber hits the road in many cases.
Now, therefore, as Catholics, as we think about this issue as rightly as we can, this is a proper concept of quote-unquote separation of church and state, the wall of separation, that there's a primacy of the church and religion in speaking into the moral affairs of society without having to then declare a kind of federalistic overtake of government processes?
Yeah, I think, look, again, this is something I've never quite understood since the Vatican Council, right, the Second Vatican Council, which is to say this is the role of the laity. And something I think some bishops don't understand, right? It's kind of like, look, you preach the moral principles. I'm not saying that bishops shouldn't be repeating day and night the fundamental moral principles that we're supposed to follow. But then they tend to go and say something like prudentially, there are prudential judgments that need to be made. Do we have taxes? Do we not have taxes? Do we raise them? Do we lower them? Do we, do the laws need to be this restrictive or not restrictive? And then all of a sudden you're getting bishops who are saying, oh, this policy is wrong. And the point is like, well, but that requires a prudential judgment of, how many immigrants can we take in what circumstances and in what ways, right? And that's when I think people start to go, well, I'm not sure I trust your prudential judgment, right, on this. I mean, it's perfectly fine for you to say, morally, we have to be welcoming. It's another thing for you to say, well, I think, we should allow 60 million more immigrants to come into the country. I think at that point, people say, well, wait a minute, that's a judgment I'm not sure I think you're qualified to make.
Randall, thank you so very much. That was extremely prudent and wise in presentation, and you're completely right. Our civic education needs to be rethought. My guest has been Dr. Randall Smith. He is Professor of Theology, Associate Professor of Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. And we've been talking about civics and civics education, especially in light of Catholicism. I'm Marcus Peter.